On the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he had said this, he showed them his hands and side. The disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. Again Jesus said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you." And with that he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone's sins, their sins are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven." Now Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." A week later his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name.
Luke 24, verses 36 to 48. While they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." They were startled and frightened, thinking they saw a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you troubled, and why do doubts rise in your minds? Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have." When he'd said this, he showed them his hands and feet. And while they still did not believe it because of joy and amazement, he asked them, "Do you have anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence. He said to them, "This is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms." Then he opened their minds so that they could understand the Scriptures. He told them, "This is what is written. The Messiah will suffer and rise from the dead on the third day, and repentance for the forgiveness of sins will be preached in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things."
Now, as I often say at the beginning of these services, I am very aware that we are an incredibly eclectic group of people who gather to engage with these online services. There will be some of you who are absolute dyed-in-the-wool members of our NWBA churches, others of you that have just stumbled across us and hung around for a while, and some of you I know are connecting through family contacts. And let me assure you, as we always say, you really are most welcome. But I hope that wherever you are today, you will bear with me if I just share a little bit of our Northwestern Baptist history. Our association was launched in its present form in 2002. It used to be called the Lancashire and Cheshire Baptist Association, but it became one of the new regional associations that were being formed at the time by Baptists in England and Wales. And I had the privilege of being appointed as the first regional minister of that new association. And something I learned as I began to take up that appointment was that a great deal of prayerful thought had gone into the preparation for this new beginning in our life together. And people at the time were very keen to make the point that this was not just a rebrand or a bit of reorganisation, but a reclaiming of our purpose and our identity as church communities and church communities in covenant partnership with one another. And as they explored what that meant together, it culminated in what came to be known as our 2021 vision. And I probably need to make the point that that was 20:21 as it was presented at the time. And what was explained to me was that there were three elements of thought that lay behind that. The first, that a great deal of the consultation and thinking that led up to it took place in the final years of the 20th century as it rolled over into the 21st. And there was a sense that we were relaunching at that moment in time when one century, one millennium was coming to an end and a new one was beginning. And we very much wanted to capture that mood of anticipation that existed at the time, of being a community of churches equipped and ready for this new millennium as it dawned. And it was also founded, the second element, on the idea of vision. You might, if you're talking about someone's eyesight, say that if it's perfect, they've got 20/20 vision. And part of the idea that we were seeking to convey was, we can see what's in front of us, but we can see more than that. We can see the possibilities of God's kingdom. We believe in a God who can do far much more than we might hope or imagine. And so if 2020 is perfect physical vision, then we have a spiritual vision that is 2021. We believe that there is more that we have yet to see. But for all that those two elements were very much present in the thinking of our Baptist community at the time, the core meaning of that 2021 in that vision statement was actually the Bible reference from John's Gospel that was included in one of our readings this morning. John chapter 20 verse 21. John 20:21. And the words of Jesus appear there, as the Father has sent me, I am sending you. And what we wanted to say is that's what we're all about. That was the conclusion that Northwest Baptist came to at the time. This is what we want to define us in the coming century. The commission of Jesus. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you. Now, I am pretty sure that those who put that vision together at the time didn't have any particular year in mind when they spoke about 2021. But of course, it's interesting for us to now reflect on that in a year that is called 2021. And not only am I reasonably certain that people didn't particularly imagine this year as being singled out, but I am absolutely certain that none of the people who put that vision statement together would have ever imagined or envisaged that this would turn out to be the year that it has become. And of course, that is because it follows on from 2020 when the worldwide pandemic hit us, and indeed events have been so hugely impacted by all of that. Though at another level, we might argue that that's exactly what people had in mind in the 21 bit of the 2020 vision. There are things that we cannot see. There are things that we cannot envisage, but we're ready to embrace them. So I'm sure that nobody had a worldwide pandemic in the back of their minds at the time, but they were convinced that we needed to be a church that could embrace whatever came our way. And I have to be honest, that as I look back at all of that 20 years later, I feel hugely encouraged. You know, it's interesting that in the couple of decades since we have made that big statement, we've had a couple of quite major reviews. We've changed our constitution, we've changed the way we appoint trustees, we've changed many of our regional team members and the way they operate. And every time that we have embarked on one of those periods of reflection and that's led to significant change, we've looked again at this statement and we've been open to say, well, does that need to change as well? Do we need to find a new vision statement? And every time, even though we've reflected and we've consulted, we've always come back to the same conclusion. No, this is still who we are. This is still what we are about. Circumstances may have changed, structures may have changed, people may have changed. But at the end of the day, we are still inspired and informed by these straightforward words of Jesus: as the Father has sent me, I am sending you. And I'm sure it won't surprise you to know that in the 20 years or so since that mission statement or that vision statement was launched, I have preached many sermons on these words. But I guess that's why I feel so encouraged, because as we come together, gathering through a medium that none of us would have imagined ourselves using 20 years ago, in the midst of circumstances that were equally unimaginable, they still feel so incredibly relevant. They still have so much to say to us. We can still look at those words and say, yeah, this is what defines us. But it's perhaps worth just pausing to consider and to recognise why that is. And to me, it's because in the 2,000 years or so since Jesus first uttered them, Christian people have found many and varied ways of putting them into practice. And very often, just as is true for us today, it's been a mixture of circumstances and technology that's made it happen. So, for example, when we pick up the New Testament book of Philippians, say, we might recognise that the reason we have a written text is because that was the technology available at the time. That was the technology available when any individual wanted to communicate with people that they were physically separated from. They wrote them a letter. And the reason that this particular letter was written is because of a set of circumstances. The persecution of Christians that in turn led to the imprisonment of Paul and his forced separation from a group of people that he ideally wanted to be with. But as someone who saw himself as sent by Jesus in the way that Jesus himself had been sent, he carried on. He adapted to the situation. And we might look now and be grateful that he did, because countless generations of Christians have benefited from what he wrote. But I guess that all he saw himself doing at the time was exactly what we're doing now, using the technology of his day to adapt to the circumstances that he found himself in. And of course, with time, things have changed and changed again. Christians moved at the time from meeting in each other's homes to meeting on their own premises. Instead of teaching the faith through engagement and conversation, scholars began to write and reflect on their experience as followers of Jesus. Stories of martyrs and saints began to circulate, and eventually along came the printing press, and many of those stories became available along with our scriptures for everyone to own and to read. But it seems that key to all of that was that people never allowed themselves to become too attached to the method that they shared the good news with, but rather that basic command: as the Father has sent me, I am sending you. And part of my reason for optimism is because as I look back at the last 12 months or so, as we have shifted again from meeting rooms to YouTube, from prayer meetings to WhatsApp, from coffee mornings to Zoom gatherings, we've discovered that we still have a purpose. Even though almost every medium that we've become used to has been taken from us, there is still significance and relevance in these words of Jesus. There is still a desire among us to come together as local churches. There is still a sense that we belong together and that we can relate to one another as different congregations. When everything else is stripped away, we just simply see that underlying purpose more clearly. And you, yes, you, as you participate in this service, are part of that testimony. As you write in the comments column, as you spread messages of encouragement from churches across our region, we are saying that we still have a purpose in coming together. We still have a vision. We still have a desire to work together, to make the message of Jesus known, because that is something that can never be taken from us. And if it could, then we wouldn't be doing this now. But that isn't always an easy lesson to learn, and let's not forget how troubled some of us have been as we've been forced to make this journey together. But as we broaden the lens, so to speak, and don't just see the words of Jesus here, but the circumstances in which those words were first spoken, we begin to recognise that this was also very true for the disciples to whom Jesus spoke them. And we're going to take a few moments this morning to just reflect on those circumstances in which those disciples found themselves as they're presented to us both by John and by Luke, and help us to just understand a little bit more of what that might say to us as we look at them in our context today. And there are a great many similarities and resonances between those two accounts, but of course we also recognise that they're offered by two different people. But let's remember, first of all, that this commission of Jesus was rooted in their experience of meeting Jesus. And following Jesus and bearing witness to the events of his coming led on to that. So before they could be sent, they needed to know who Jesus was. And I would argue that the same is true for us. And so I want to look at these two readings from John and Luke and look at them from a perspective of a people who dare to believe that we are defined by that same commission that Jesus gave to his disciples. And I want us to recognise three things as we do that. The first is that they were a people who encountered Jesus. The second is that they were people who learned from Jesus. And the third thing is that they were people who shared Jesus with the world. So let's think about the first of those, encountering Jesus. And what we gather is that quite a few of those encounters with Jesus in the early days after his resurrection were quite dramatic. It's interesting that although Luke and John remember different features of these particular occasions, what they both remember is that Jesus very often began by saying, "Peace be with you," by declaring his peace. And that says two things to me. The first is that probably it was quite disturbing for those early disciples to meet Jesus after they'd witnessed his suffering and his death. And we noticed that his body was still bearing the scars of that. So we might understand why Jesus declared his peace, because I sense that people were quite troubled. But I also wonder if the reason that they both remember it is because they also sensed his peace when he spoke. And perhaps that's again why, as Luke tells us, Jesus made repeated visits, because he realised that they kind of needed to get over the shock, as it were, and really know the peace of knowing that Jesus was with them. And I think there's something significant in that, because I do sense that time and time again in the Gospels we get this message that when you are in the presence of Jesus, there was a sense of calm, there was a sense of being in the right place, there was a sense of peace that being with Jesus brought to you. And if you've been following our online reflections, you might note that we made that the theme of our reflection this week. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts. But there was clearly something special about Jesus. There was something almost magnetic about him. People wanted to be in his presence. They would crowd into houses, they would climb trees, they would run along lake shores to do anything to get near to Jesus. Because all through the Gospels, encountering Jesus was important for people. And if there's one thing that we've learned in the last 12 months, it's the same. You know, we may not have been able to go to our regular meeting places or gather with our usual friends or participate in our valued activities, but we have still been able to encounter Jesus. Now, we all knew that. There are plenty of verses in our scriptures that tell us that nothing can separate us from the love of God, that there's nowhere that we can hide from the presence of God. But knowing it is one thing. We have had the chance to experience and to discover it in recent months. And what we are reminded by these early stories from after the resurrection is that that matters. Yes, they sang their hymns, they shared their stories, they learned their scriptures, but they encountered Jesus. That was what defined them. That was the root of their commission. They were people who had met with Jesus. And that didn't only matter to his followers, it mattered to Jesus. And we see that, I think, reflected in his concern for Thomas. You know, I find the story of Thomas quite interesting, or at least I find the way that Thomas tends to get portrayed in religious culture quite interesting. You know, how often have you heard him defined as doubting Thomas? You know, it's interesting, isn't it, how good we are as human beings at doing exactly what people in society around us doing, and allow people to become defined by their one perceived mistake. And we love speaking of doubting Thomas as though we never have our doubts or our struggles or our uncertainties. I wonder how different our perception might be if instead of calling this the story of doubting Thomas, we called it the story of gracious Jesus. After all, it is Jesus who is supposed to be the focus of the Gospels. Because if I'm honest, I see a lot of myself in Thomas. And I sense that there will be very few of us, if we're truly honest, who will not have had our moments, particularly in the last 12 months, when we've struggled to believe, or we've struggled to make sense, or we've struggled to hang on to hope in the midst of despair. And what I see in this story is a Jesus who comes back when Thomas is there, and gives him the chance to catch up with everybody else. What I see in this story is the same Jesus who describes himself earlier in the Gospels through the story of a shepherd who locks up the 99 sheep that he knows are in the fold and sets out to find the one that's got lost. And so perhaps some of us have struggled to encounter Jesus in the last 12 months, or perhaps we struggled to encounter Jesus a long time before any of this lockdown and everything else began. Perhaps we've had our doubts, perhaps we've had our struggles. Well, I believe that there is a great deal for people like that in this momentary exchange that Jesus has with Thomas, because Jesus invites him to simply do whatever it takes to be convinced that he has encountered the risen Jesus. And I don't think this was Jesus kind of going, no, I told you so, I have risen from the dead. I sense that it was Jesus saying, come on, Thomas, I won't leave you behind. Trust me, I really am here. God is there to be encountered, and God won't give up on you if you struggle to respond. I want you to hold on to that thought as we look for a moment at another aspect of what we're looking at today, and that is that we're also called to learn from Jesus. You know, we're told on more than one occasion that in those early days after the resurrection, Jesus spent time explaining things to his followers. We see that happening on the road to Emmaus, and there are huge echoes of that in what Luke records later. He explains to them why he had to die. He explains to them why, even though he's risen from the dead, he will nonetheless be leaving them. He explains, as Luke tells us here, how the scriptures of the Old Testament foretold his coming. He explains that there are many, many things for them to learn. And yet we can also be reasonably certain that they didn't learn everything. For one thing, we read in the book of Acts that they had to then go on a couple of years or so later to arrange a major council to just kind of fully understand their future relationship with the Jewish law. When we read the New Testament epistles, we very quickly realise that there are a whole load of issues that the early believers were still trying to work out in their minds. So they didn't learn everything, but they learned enough. They learned enough to know that they could trust Jesus. They learned enough to know and to believe that God had a purpose, even in traumatic events like the ones that they had been witnesses to. They learned not so that they could become a people of absolute certainty, but so that they could become a people of faith. And I think it's interesting to see the way in which Jesus so often taught, which tended to be about explaining things after the event. We see that right through the Gospels. When Jesus said to the first disciples, "Follow me," they just dropped everything and followed him. And then he began to explain to them what they'd signed up to, and began to explain to them what the kingdom of God was all about. When crowds saw Jesus, they just instinctively gathered. And then Jesus responded by sharing with them his stories and his teaching. And of course, here the same things happen. After they have witnessed the death and the resurrection of Jesus, then Jesus begins to explain what it's all about. Now, of course, we can recognise that Jesus had spoken of his death and resurrection on a number of occasions in the Gospels before those events took place. But we kind of get the impression from the disciples' reactions that no matter how many times he told them, it never seemed to have quite sunk in. They never fully grasped that he really was being serious when he said that he was going to be handed over to the chief priests and the Pharisees and be put to death. So perhaps the way that Jesus teaches is more a reflection of us. It's not so much that God doesn't want to explain everything, but we're not always ready to understand. It strikes me that many of those disciples just weren't ready to understand the cross until it had taken place. And I guess that's true for all of us, that sometimes it's only in the light of life circumstances that we're ready to learn some of life's lessons. And that says a lot to me about where we might go from here. We don't have all the answers as to why a worldwide pandemic took place. We can't just neatly slot God into that and say, well, this is what God was doing, this is what God was saying. But what we can do is stop and ask, what has this now made me ready to learn? What have recent events made me ready to discover about this Jesus that I am called to follow? And if, as there inevitably will be, there are unanswered questions, then we can have faith in God's goodness and God's purpose, even if we can't figure everything out. I don't believe that God is calling us to be a church that has all the answers. But what I sense we are called to be is a church that has enough answers to know that we can trust God with what we can't explain. A church that encourages others to trust God as well. But this does nonetheless say to me that as we move forward, we are called to be a people who are open to learn. And I think that there is something wonderfully ambiguous about that statement in verse 45 of our reading from Luke. Then he opened their minds. Now, was that a moment of miracle? Was this a sudden spiritual anointing of knowledge that Jesus poured out on his followers? Or is that just Luke's way of summarising everything that's gone before? Because we're told that Jesus explained the books of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms. Were they learning from Jesus? Were they learning with Jesus? Were they learning through Jesus? We don't know. And I'm not sure that we actually need to know. But what we might recognise is that we're not called to a thoughtless faith that doesn't seek to understand and make sense of our story. But nor are we called to a clinical, static faith that is just a matter of learning a load of facts. Jesus invites us into a relationship. And when relationships are real and authentic, we inevitably learn and find out all kinds of facts about those that we care about. And usually those facts help us to care about them even more. Knowing Jesus and knowing about Jesus are not alternatives. They're both aspects of the same thing. They're both aspects of being a people who are in relationship with Jesus, who encounter Jesus, and who are ready to learn from Jesus. And as we reflect on the journey that we've been on, what are we now ready to learn? How are we going to learn as we seek God in the days ahead? And that brings me to my third point. We're called to encounter Jesus, we're called to learn from Jesus, and we are called to share Jesus. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you. Now, we have been on quite a journey in the last year. And there are ways in which we used to share Jesus that we might be longing to see reclaimed, or perhaps we're actually glad to have moved on from them. And we've learned to share Jesus in new ways, made necessary not only through lockdown, but also because of the many questions and concerns that have emerged in society. And again, some of us might be longing to now put those behind us, and others of us might never want them to stop. At least I get an extra hour in bed every Sunday morning now. But this is where I want us to just stop and pick up on some of the things that we've already said. Because we're not called to share Jesus in the world that existed 18 months ago, and we're not forever called to share Jesus in the world that we've created for ourselves now. Our calling is to share Jesus in the months and years that lie ahead of us. And as we observed earlier, that is always a matter of remembering that our methods and our circumstances are secondary to our calling. As the Father sent me, I am sending you. But I do think that we've learned some valuable lessons in recent months. So let me take you back to what we were saying earlier about encountering Jesus. We have learned to encounter Jesus in new places and in new ways. And if we are capable of encountering Jesus in our homes and through our smartphones, then our next door neighbour, our colleagues at work are also capable of encountering Jesus in those ways and those places too. And if Jesus was prepared to invest time in the reluctant and the doubtful like Thomas, then Jesus is no less willing to be patient with those who struggle and doubt today. Jesus does not send us into the world without him. Just as he lived out his own ministry in constant relationship with the Father, he sends us in the same way into a world where he is already waiting to encounter those who open their hearts to him. And I hope that our recent experiences of encountering Jesus in our everyday lives and our everyday places might give us the confidence to believe that he is present in the everyday lives of others. And our calling as missionary disciples is not to convince everyone into our way of thinking or to get everyone to turn up at the things that we like to organise. It's to help them discover where God might be encountered in the reality of their lives. And let's recognise too that Jesus tended to offer explanations in the wake of experience. And that probably has more to do with how we're wired than any failings or preferences on God's part. And if life circumstances have opened us up to learn new things of God, then how much might that also be true for others whose life paths cross ours? But I also sense that one of the reasons that Jesus very often gave explanations in the light of encounters is because Jesus didn't need explanations in order for people to want to meet him. They just simply saw something attractive, something they wanted to be with, someone who gave them a sense of peace. And if we are to be a people who make Jesus known, then we need to look like Jesus. We need to act like Jesus. When people are with us, they need to feel like they are with Jesus. We need to be communities of faith in whom people recognize those same attributes that brought crowds running to Jesus whenever he hit town. So yeah, our world has changed. Yes, we remain quite uncertain about how everything is eventually going to pan out. But what has not changed is that we are a people who are invited to encounter Jesus, to learn from Jesus, and to share Jesus. Our defining purpose remains. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you.